Good morning, everyone. This morning we will have our keynote presentation, and as we mentioned yesterday, we are experimenting with a different format, and we're going to have a fireside chat. We don't have a fire, but we do have fire-red chairs, I guess. So it's my pleasure to introduce Nadine Ritter, our CAST president, who will be moderating the discussion today with Dr. Amy Abernethy.
I'm going to have a little bit of a different introduction today than what we normally do. We've got a different format, and so I want to actually take advantage of that. You know, we've been to how many hundreds of professional meetings in our careers, and they always start out the same way, where the person who's introducing the speaker goes through their CV and talks about their specific education and training and highlights some of their contributions to the field, states the title of their talk, and says, so please join me in welcoming, insert the name, right? But I want to do this session differently. This session is going to allow us to engage with one of the most amazingly effective communicators I have ever seen. I don't say that lightly. It's not idle flattery because she's sitting here. It's not because she's at the FDA. It's because I actually saw her talking on the internet quite a number of times recently, and I was blown away. You'll see in just a minute what I'm telling you. Let me tell you how I know this. So in preparing for this talk, first off, Jamie sent me the draft sessions and questions, and I looked at them and I went, Jamie, they're all about clinical stuff. Do you know that we're CMC people? So I poo-pooed the idea. We need to make this more CMC relevant. Jamie, to her credit, persevered. I was thinking, we're CMC scientists. The closest that we get to the clinic is what we put in the syringe or put in the vial. So we have nothing to do with patient health records. How is this possibly relevant to us? Then Ken sent me a YouTube video, and I began looking at Dr. Abernethy's past and realizing, well, this is fascinating from a patient perspective. This is interesting to me, but I still don't see the relevance to CMC. I'm not quite sure I'm there. Then on Monday, we had a CMC strategy forum where we were talking about the effect of polysorbates and excipients and things like host cell proteins on batches of product for particles, which is a typically CMC issue. And the question was coming up, boy, if only we could find out whether these particles had any relation to clinical efficacy or safety, or if only we could track and trend how the batches of polysorbate or the different variances in host cell proteins that might occur from batch to batch in drug substance, if they have any clinical relevance, or if they have no clinical relevance. Wouldn't that be a fascinating piece of information? And then it clicked. When I saw the rest of her videos, oh my God, it's possible. Jamie mentioned to me, that's the point, Nadine, that there might be a way for us to take this massive body of manufacturing data that we have and correlate it to the massive body of clinical data that we have. We just have to figure out how to actually do that, one step before the other. And so with that, I learned that what this issue is with big data and data mining is something that is actually very relevant to CMC and very relevant to patient health. But beyond that, I'm going to use one of Dr. Abernethy's own paradigms and tell you that in doing this kind of work, I also found a second use of your data. I found that by looking at her YouTube videos and correlating it to her CV, because her videos go back, I think the oldest one I found was 9 years. I can see the pedigree that she has evolved in from her time as a medical academician at Duke University Medical School to when she went into industry at Flatiron, where she was managing data systems, to where she is now at the FDA. And so I could see not just a piece of paper that said this is the person that would be speaking to us. I could see evidence of it in her words, in her actions, in her analogies. And I will tell you that in terms of analogies, I love them. She blows me out of the water. Her analogies are so clear. And in fact, I mentioned to her that I hope she uses one of them today about patient data. So now I am honored to introduce to you Dr. Amy Abernethy, who is the Principal Deputy Commissioner and Acting Chief Information Officer at the FDA, for our fireside chat.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Okay, so I've got a couple of questions here that we penciled out, but we're going to have maybe one or two questions and let Dr. Abernethy give her some of her vision, and then we're going to open it to the floor, and then I'll have one last question before we finish the session. I will warn you that in 45 minutes, I doubt very seriously that she will be able to get through a fraction of what she's interested in, but we'll make a stab at it. One of the questions that we have is the idea of using these data systems and this aggregated data, this collated data, and very importantly, this curated data to be able to monitor trends that we might see with some of our biotechnology products. So if you could give us a little bit of an explanation of what your background has been for this in managing data, and then what you see the value of it in the FDA with the cross-office work that you're doing.
Terrific. So first of all, I am so honored to be here with you, and I got a lot to live up to now for that conversation. And I thought what I would do in the first section is take you back to the clinic as a starting point, and this will connect up, I believe, to your core question about where does this story go as it relates to data and the relevance to CMC. But I'm a melanoma doc, so when I was in the oncology clinic in the 2000s, when I would sit and talk to a person sitting in front of me, in the 2000s, melanoma was really what I called the 50-50 disease. 50% of the people who came to see me in the clinic, many of whom were younger than 40 years old, were going to pass away within 5 years. It was a terrible problem. These days, that's not the case. Melanoma is a disease that has really been not completely conquered, but for many people, a curable or livable disease in ways that have just escalated over the last 10 years because of the work that you do. And so now let me go back to circa 2008, 2009. And in the clinic, I had a lot of patients, but there was one who to this day sits on my shoulder. And we'll call her Janet. She was an ER nurse. She had red freckles and red hair, and this is kind of curly red hair. And she'd always kind of come in, she's got her scrubs on, and she'd sit down and talk. Her mother had had melanoma. She had melanoma on her arm, and she'd had lymph nodes. And for Janet, who was already a healthcare professional, she understood the fact that the problem that she was dealing with was likely genetic. She understood that ultimately, because of the lymph nodes in her arms and what was found on the surgical path, that this was probably a devastating disease for her life. She also understood that treatments were coming out, and maybe one of those might be meaningful for her. And so, in fact, we enrolled her into a clinical trial. And when we enrolled her in the clinical trial, about a year into the trial, the study was discontinued due to safety reasons. And so Janet and I, because of the fact that we knew that there was information in the clinical trial data set about her genetics, there was information about the features of her melanoma underneath the microscope, and there was information about the treatments that she had received now and in the past, we actually called the company and we said, hey, can we get Janet's information to use both for her care, and then maybe some other study could make use of that information. And the company said, no, we own the data. And let me tell you that Janet, remember, she's got red hair, and she is, you can just imagine, she is incensed. And one of the things that happened as a part of this evolving story in the clinic was that Janet basically, she said, wait a second, that's information that I contributed to this story. That's information about my life that needs to live on way past my death. It might make sense for me now, it might help me in the next treatment that we try and choose, but it also might help somebody else, including maybe my sister who's got my same genes, or other people with melanoma, or other people who happen to be like me and worried about my fertility if I did get through melanoma treatments. So these are the things that Janet told me in the clinic, and that led to us starting to think about, well, wait a second. Janet's story across time, in that story that I just told you, was locked into a corporate database. But practically speaking, it wasn't really locked in the database. It actually resided in another place, which was in her medical record. And circa about 2008, 2009, those records were transferring from paper charts to now the electronic health record. Now, interestingly, for Janet, they moved to the electronic health record, but probably like your CMC records, the electronic health record is actually just a digital filing cabinet that reflects the PDF version of what was in the chart. So for the most part, we now had a problem sitting in front of us, which was how do we clean up the information electronic health record And ultimately, how do we take all of those PDFs, or essentially digital paper, and turn it into analyzable variables that we can make sense of over time? And I think we can come back to that in a few minutes. But my core point is Janet had a story. Her story is a longitudinal story. It's the journey of Janet. And her story, including all of the features, her genetics, her treatment, how she's experienced her treatments, how she's responded, what's happened to her disease across time, her personal concerns, including quality of life, and her additional concerns and experiences, such as her fertility, were all longitudinal data stories that were captured in her medical record and in the data sets that sit next to her medical record that now could be pulled together. So this story, ultimately, of Janet and Janet's longitudinal data is actually a story that's playing out in every one of our medical charts all across the United States and all across the world. And in fact, we're also creating digital footprints in many other ways. The digital footprints that come out of our accelerometers or biosensors or watches. The digital footprints that happen when we're on the internet. The digital footprints that are a part of our genetic ancestry. And so these data sets now, these days, can start to be pulled together in many different ways. Before I leave this topic and move it then to this sort of landscape of real-world evidence, I just wanted to add one additional piece that you brought up, which is that in 2011 or 12, I started thinking about Janet and what she had told me in the clinic and realized that in a lot of ways what Janet was saying about that original time with her chart and it getting locked in the data set for the clinical trial, she reminded me then that she had really donated her story to the development of that drug. And in fact, when we donate something, for example, organ donation or blood donation, we have a set of features that we can all understand as a community about the privilege of the donation as well as the privilege of the use. And so I choose to participate in a clinical trial, or I choose to donate my information to a larger body of knowledge. And so the importance of patient choice, people being able to say, yes, this is okay. Importantly, one of the things Janet advocated for, and I think is absolutely right, is I should be able to rescind my donation if you don't use it in the way that I said you could use it, and I should also be able to make sure that the information about me can be repurposed for other things. So she could give her information to the Melanoma Society or for Alzheimer's research. That ultimately there should be technical mechanisms to make this possible, as well as things like toggle switches. You can get on your, get on Google and tell them what you do and do not want to have happen about you. And Janet was really vocal about the fact that as we think about all of our data going into the larger body of story in the future, that that's going to be important. And then the last thing is that Janet said to me, and I want to be proud. She said, I want everybody to know I participated in a clinical trial, that this drug was being developed with my help and everything else. And just like that, in organ donation, you can put on a sticker that basically says, I donated today. And so ultimately having ways of signaling in the community spirit, this is why this is important to me and proud, was one of the other things that came through. I'm going to stop there because I think that that's going to turn us into the conversation that's going on in the United States right now around real-world evidence. But I wanted to see if that setup gets to some of the things you wanted to talk about, Nadine.
It does. Thank you very much. And I hope that, to me, the analogy of how we have systems in place that have been developed over many decades to donate blood and how it's preserved and how it's protected and how that information is used, anonymized, aggregated, is a good analogy to other health record information. It's data, not a tangible material, but it is still, in the same vein of that. One thing that really interests a lot of us in this room from the other side of it is data quality, because we can have big data, but if you could speak a little bit to your passion about making sure that the data are appropriately checked for quality, because one of the downsides of a lot of data is that it can be a lot of noise and a lot of junk. So could you tell us some of your ideas about how to make sure that these big database systems will get the information in and that it's been cross-checked to be accurate and complete and that someone has been assuring that the information is real?
So I think I'll do is I'll first start with the conversation around real-world evidence. I think many of you probably in this room have been hearing a lot about real-world evidence, and then pull that through to this critical issue of data quality. And I'll hit on some FDA things in the middle there so you know how the FDA is thinking about this. So the story I just told you about Janet and her data actually is very relevant to this landscape of what's now being termed real-world evidence. And practically speaking, there's been a vision for a long time that observational data, data that's basically naturally occurring, whether that's in clinical practice or in corollary databases like genomics databases, or intentionally collected like registries, could now be used to confidently generate understanding of what works for whom and when. And we call this landscape real-world evidence. The FDA has defined real-world evidence as evidence generated outside of the traditional clinical trial construct. It may be prospective, such as a prospective registry, or it may be retrospective, for example, information as an electronic health record that is being collected for clinical care and now taken and put into secondary use. Also, the other thing about real-world evidence, which I think is very relevant for the CMC community, is that real-world evidence data sets these days can be combined. So electronic health record data being combined, for example, with next-generation sequencing data to now understand the interrelationship between genomic sequence of the tumor and what happens to that tumor when exposed to different treatments. So that's kind of the growing landscape of real-world evidence, and there's been a lot of excitement about can we put real-world evidence to work to accelerate clinical development, as well as understand real-world performance of medical products across time. Real-world evidence was certainly a core part of the focus within the 21st Century Cures Act that was signed into law in December of 2016. And practically speaking, what that law said is that the FDA needs to figure out if and how we could confidently use real-world evidence as a part of the totality of evidence as we think about medical product approvals, as well as monitoring medical products across time. And the 21st Century Cures Act compelled the FDA to look at two potential use cases or topics for real-world evidence. One was label expansions, so essentially secondary indications, and the other one was post-marketing commitments and post-marketing requirements. And so importantly, with the 21st Century Cures Act and this idea that, wait a second, there's so much data out there that we might be put to good use, now the FDA has been trying to figure out how do we put it to good use. In December of 2018, so 2 years later, FDA put forth a framework for how we were going to start to understand how to confidently use real-world evidence in the settings as described by 21st Century Cures. And what we said was we need to know three things. Let's come back to your point. First, we need to understand what data sets are fit for purpose. What data sets can we use for what tasks? And data quality is going to be a big feature here. The second thing we need to understand is how do we have the right analytic frameworks and what analyses are fit for purpose? Because there's sort of this magical thinking out there that what we're going to do is take all the information that sits in the electronic health record and push some button and magically we're going to know the answers to a whole bunch of questions. It turns out we don't have all the right analytic approaches to solve these problems. And the third thing that the framework said is, and by the way, we need to test out, just like you do in CMC, a series of different use cases to understand which ones we can confidently put this totality of real-world evidence to use and where can we not do that. And examples of those use cases, some of them are pre-approval, some of them are post-approval. So on the pre-approval side, real-world evidence certainly can be used to design better and smarter traditional clinical trials. Real-world evidence can help us find patients for clinical trials. So finding Janet and knowing that there's a woman in Durham, North Carolina with a 3C melanoma who might match this clinical trial, we now can see from real-world data that sits in electronic health records. In 2008, it was just because she and I were talking on the phone and figured it out. These days, a pop-up happens. Real-world evidence in the pre-market space might also be used, for example, as historical controls. And one of the big areas of focus to try and figure this out is, can we use this as a way of reducing the need for randomization and allocating patients to potentially inferior treatments? That does not mean that we want to indiscriminately use real-world evidence for historical controls. And so it's really important to figure this out. In the post-marketing side, certainly we're exploring real-world evidence for secondary indications, as 21st Century Cures said, as well as post-marketing commitments and requirements, and then really trying to understand how does real-world evidence help us fill in the gaps of understanding real-world performance across time. Coming back to the question of quality, if I think about Janet's record in the clinic, even if I think about her genomic sequence that sits in an NGS database, I don't know that I'm always all that good when I'm in the clinic in terms of documenting every detail in the same way I might in a case report form for a clinical trial. Sometimes I have some cut and paste errors. Maybe Janet told me one thing today and tells me something different 2 weeks later, and those don't line up. So there's all kinds of challenges with data quality in the electronic health record. Also, as I said, it's digital paper, and it's not necessarily analyzable variables. So there's lots of cleanup that has to be done just in the transferring of information. And even in the next generation sequencing database. NGS, this is instrumentation data, highly reliable. But guess what? Our algorithms change over time as we move to now deciding what this particular sequence means in terms of its variant calls. So it might change over time, and there's quality challenges there. Practically speaking, as FDA, we recognize that data quality in the real-world evidence space is a huge issue. We also recognize data quality in the clinical trial space is not perfect either. And one thing I always think about and say is that all data have warts. We need to get over the emotional reaction to there might be poor quality data and ask what do we need to do to get smarter and smarter about understanding when the quality concerns actually really matter and how to fix them when they do matter or how not to use those data sets. And so some of the things I think you might see us do are come up with ways of measuring data quality in consistent ways so we can just talk about it in transparent form. You'll see us talk more about when certain data quality concerns mean those data sets can or cannot be used. And you'll see us work together with industry about what kinds of things can we do together to make sure that data quality is improved on the front end as well as better curated on the back end. And the last thing I'll say, and goes back to what I learned from Janet in the clinic, data quality gets better with use. And a very practical example, if you show a doctor in the clinic information on a report, he or she is going to tell you when it's wrong. And then you can go back and fix the database. So the more that you use the information at all times, you actually clean up data and make it better with time. And so as FDA, we're really thinking a lot about data quality.
Yeah, this reminds me, just in listening to this, of a project I was on several years ago with an oncology advocacy group, where they had collected from physicians hundreds of thousands of tumor samples that had been frozen away, and they're archived away. They were annotated so that you could go back and research them, maybe look at histology of them if someone was discovering something new. But the problem that they had then was that the people who were collecting those samples at the clinical side and the people who were freezing them down or preserving them and then putting them on slides and then putting them in the freezer and then putting the data, it was all handwritten. And there was no cross-checking of, do we have the right box with the right slides, with the right tumor, with the right patient on it, so that if some researcher comes in the future and says, we want to find a patient that had these characteristics with this tumor at this age, with, et cetera, you couldn't be sure the box you picked up was in fact the correct one. And so the lab was actually very, they had a lot of foresight. They were instituting quality practices for documentation and data to try to do two things: get away from manual entry as much as possible on paper and try to standardize it in terms of a form. And this is not patient data so much as it is tumor data, right? It's boxes and freezers and things of that nature. And then also make sure that they had an auditing function, that they would go back and periodically they would do actual real audits, where they would pull the files and they would check to make sure if this file said it had this box and this freezer and this set of slides in it, and we go and test it and check it, are they there? Because they wanted to be sure that for all the future, all these millions of samples that they had were going to be accurately reflecting the sources and the information, so that they wouldn't either lose a good hit on a drug or come away with the wrong conclusion because of this library they had of actual materials.
So I think in the next section, we're going to talk about what we're doing on our technology front at
Right.
FDA, and we'll connect the dots there. But as I think about my former life, so I was in an industry where we were thinking about building and curating real-world evidence data sets. I was at Duke. We were thinking about how do we analyze, how do we generate this in the clinic, et cetera. And we had big programs, including clinical trials programs, when we were doing this across time. And one of the things that, so you've mentioned several things, putting in QMS, quality management systems up front to try and improve the standardization and the collection of information. You mentioned audit and essentially cross-checking. You mentioned the importance of digitizing whatever information that you can. You also mentioned that there's going to be errors along the way. And one of the things that I reflect across time, and especially also working in this big data space, is that we need to figure out how to intentionally insert solutions that reduce the chance of data errors. We also need to add in more and more solutions that allow us to accommodate and deal with data errors. So practically speaking, as there's more data, that means that we actually have more errors, but it also means we have more data sets that allow us to do, for example, triangulation and cross-check and be able to bring in proxy variables to make sure that these pieces line up. We've got more opportunity to, for example, double and triple check things. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in making use of all the different data sets that sit around, for example, those samples to allow us to accommodate for those data errors. The only other thing I would say is, as these data sets grow across time, there's always the issue that we need to go back and check. Issues such as this path, this piece of tumor that's been sitting in the freezer, was it managed in the right way across time? And are there changes to the tumor that ultimately mean that structurally we're not going to be able to understand the biology in the ways that we thought? So there's lots of checking that we're going to have to do in the future that we just didn't used to do with our data sets.
Right. And so the last question I'll ask before we turn it over to the audience is that could you just speak a little bit to some of the initiatives? You're going to be coming up on, about 1 year at the FDA soon. And could you give us a little bit of an overview of what your mission and vision is for the role that you've got?
So I came to FDA as Principal Deputy Commissioner just about a year ago. And when I arrived, I thought, okay, I have 3 things I'm going to work on: precision medicine, focus on the patient, and real-world evidence. And when I got to FDA, what I realized was that in order to work on those things, oh, wait a second, FDA is going to need to be more forward-looking and modern in the way that we collect, store, manage, and use data, if that's going to be the future that we're all moving toward. And in fact, I think, and as you'll see in just a second, I'd submit to you, it is the future that we're all moving toward. 21st Century Cures kicked us off, but then lots of other things happening across industry, but the FDA wasn't really quite ready. So first thing that happened was I took on the role of acting CIO in April, May to try and advance this set of activities. And in September of 2019, we announced the Technology Modernization Action Plan, which then has been rapidly followed by our Enterprise Data Plan, which was announced 2 weeks ago at the Consumer Electronics Show. What are these plans, and again, how are they relevant to the CMC community? The Technology Modernization Action Plan is 3 parts. The first is focused on shoring up the technical infrastructure for the FDA, making sure that our enterprise IT is a robust, technically forward organization, really ready to manage and use data in the cloud. That doesn't mean 100% of what we do is in the cloud, but it means probably 80% of what we're going to be doing is in the cloud. And that's important because it sets us up for essentially distributed management of data, the ability to have APIs and cloud-based exchange in a secure way, and also it sets us up for how we're going to more efficiently use data at FDA in the future. And so our technical underpinning is going to be really important because the way that we use data, the way we receive data, is then relevant to how you send it to us and therefore how you store and use data on your side. It also prepares us to be able to be more effective with respect to how we use artificial intelligence and track and trace capabilities like blockchain. And so that kind of is the preparatory step. Second step of the Technology Modernization Action Plan are use cases. Practical examples that allow us to see and feel and get our head around what is this next step in a more modern FDA look like, so that you as industry can prepare yourselves and we as FDA can prepare ourselves. And I'm going to give you 2 examples in just a second once I give you the steps of the plan. The third thing in the Technology Modernization Action Plan is opening up our communication channels with the data and tech industry and the innovators in this space. Why does that matter? If we want to use data and tech to make the process of drug development more efficient, to allow us to use sensors and advanced manufacturing and track and trace across our drug supply chain. If we want to do all of those things, we need the tech innovators working with us to build the solutions, and we need to know, as FDA, what do we need to do in order to make sure that tech innovators can confidently come into this space and build the solutions. So that's the third part of the plan. And then the fourth part of the plan that we just moved into is the data plan. And there, it's really starting to get our head around, as the FDA, how do we need to start clarifying for industry and for ourselves what our enterprise data stance is going to look like. I promised you I'd give you 2 examples. So in November, we ultimately announced the 7 and 15-day global safety reporting. And I think this is probably a perfect example of where this whole space is going. INDs, so CBER, you have an IND, investigational new drug application. You then have the expectations for 7 and 15-day safety reporting. Ultimately, a sponsor, a CRO, is collecting the information on MedWatch forms. Information is ultimately being generated in the clinic, going into databases, moving to PDFs that are sent to us electronically as PDFs, and our medical reviewers then look at a whole bunch of forms and try and find safety signals by visual inspection, sticky notes, and Excel spreadsheets. One of our medical reviewers said, wait a second, can't we take the databases that the sponsors have and hook up the pipes to the FDA so that the data can flow electronically as opposed to through MedWatch forms directly into FDA's databases? Then we overlay a visualization engine and we can find the signals more efficiently and also save medical reviewer time. In November, we announced the new guidances that have just been put out as that whole system has now come to bear. It's been piloted with 5 sponsors up until now, and now over the next 2 years, this will be how we transition to the full movement of safety data directly as structured data through an application programming interface into FDA, ready to be used as information FDA. And you can see how that example, that real life use case, has taught us a whole bunch of things about what do we need to build technically, what kind of guidances do we write, how do we train reviewers, how do we communicate with industry, what's our security stance, all the things that we need to do. The last example that I'll give you is we're also thinking about, for example, real-time oncology review, and as our oncologists are now starting to review applications, new drug applications in real time, how do we do the same thing we learned how to do for 7 and 15-day safety reporting, but now for the data that's coming in for the application, so those can be reviewed in real time. So lessons learned move across our use cases.
Excellent. So I'll open it right now to some questions from the floor or from the app. So Jamie, are you monitoring the app? Do we have questions from the floor? Okay, sure. I can hardly see up here, so if there's anybody that has a couple of questions.
So if anybody wants to come to the microphones, you can come to the microphones.
Yeah, exactly right. Oh, we have some, okay. We're getting it.
I'll go ahead and kick off. Christine Moore from Merck. So there is going to be, as I'm sure you know, Amy, a public meeting in March on this topic, modernizing the Food and Drug Administration data strategy. And I was just hoping you could share a little bit more of the intent of that meeting.
Absolutely, thank you. We announced this meeting, and really this is a starting point. It's not intended to be an ending point. I can't imagine that we can build the entire data strategy for the FDA based on one meeting. But as FDA, we really need to understand from industry as well as other stakeholders, what are the challenges that we need to be paying attention to? What do we need to do? Issues such as privacy. How should we be thinking about data storage and aggregation in the future? What are your concerns as we change our data stance? What does that mean and your concerns across industry? As well as, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? So for example, we've talked about CMC. Perhaps the records that you're keeping might be in your hopes and dreams to start to connect up to the greater system So that your example in the very beginning of combining the clinical data to what we see in terms of changes in the CMC profile can now be matched together to understand what changes really matter. And so being able to hear where the industry thinks we should be going is going to be important as we set our data strategy. Importantly, as FDA, as you know, we've got different centers, so different product centers, drugs, biologics, devices, food, and there are going to be different concerns across centers, and so we need to understand what do we need to think about at the enterprise level versus also what do we need to think about at the business-specific level.
Hi,
Yes,
thanks.
this is,
Ken Prentice from Shape Therapeutics. I've got a comment and then a question. My first comment was I really like the idea, you sort of put an earworm in my head about the idea that companies are stewards for clinical data rather than owners for clinical data. And I'm not quite sure what that means, but I think it could be very beneficial for the community. So my question has to do with data and the amount of data. And what I hear is being said is a considerable body of data being collected, whether it's through high resolution techniques or number of techniques. And this group has for a number of years tried to figure out how to reduce the amount of data that we're taking from an efficiency standpoint or a cost standpoint. So I was wondering if you had comment on how to navigate sort of to the relevant data and the relevant data sets.
Such an interesting question. And, parsimony, which is what your point is around, as a community, you've been trying to figure out how to achieve parsimony, the smallest amount of the right data to solve the problem. Parsimony is equally as important as volume that is useful. And the reason parsimony is so important is it steers your attention to the things that matter. And also, the other reason parsimony is so important is that you can only do so many things. So deciding the things that you're going to do really well is kind of critical to the future. And so as a person who's been thinking about data for a long time, and that's my core shtick, I would argue that there is great value in focusing on that which matters. There's also great value in surrounding that which matters, that which is the core focus of what you have, with other kind of data sets that can take what matters to you and put it in context or highlight new and important signals. And so figuring out how to cross those two are particularly important. And let me give you an example that may or may not be helpful. In the patient-reported data space, think about adverse effects. I could make it so that every time you come into the clinic, I ask you 150 questions before you come see the doctor, so I can make sure every single thing has been possibly answered. Now, first of all, let's imagine you're answering them on an iPad and they're coming at you one question after the other. At one point or another, you just get tired of answering, so you just hit the same button over and over again. So because I've just gone with volume and not thought about what questions really matter, instead what I've done is ultimately make it that past question 10, the data quality falls off kind of critically. But if I instead really focus on what things really matter, I'm going to get higher quality, high resolution information that's about just 10. And now the question becomes, how do I use those 10 to signal when I need an additional 10 questions about something that is a corollary that's going to put the answers to those 10 in context? So for example, I find out this person has pain. Now I need to understand more characteristics about their pain. And that's how I go after the additional information. And so the parsimony is figuring out what do I need as my core data, and then how am I going to append additional critical variables just for that moment in time or that context that really matters. And I think those are the kinds of things we're going to need to continuously work through.
Cool.
yeah. Could I have a question
Sure.
here? Kathy Franciscan from Genentech. It's absolutely tremendous to hear your thoughts about modernization of data handling. And indeed, we're seeing more and more of this sort of new frontier of medicines that involve generation of tremendous amounts of data. And I was wondering if you could share some more thoughts about achieving that balance. In your example about your patient, Janet, there was tremendously valuable data related to her particular case, and it could be relevant for other medicines being developed, et cetera. But there's a fine balance there in respecting patient privacy while sharing data. And the more information that's tied together, the more valuable it is. And yet by doing so, there's much less patient privacy. So could you share some more thoughts on that?
You know, I used to be a complete techno geek, and all I sort of seemed to do was think about the technical side. And then something flipped the switch in my head that made me realize the privacy side and the ethics of this are as important, if not more important, to get right than the technical side. As a matter of fact, I came to FDA and I was like, what do you mean we don't have a chief privacy officer? So it's one of the things I've been sort of working on. Ultimately, the practical reality is almost all data are re-identifiable these days. And you start putting data sets together, the more data sets you put together, the more re-identifiable the information. And as you highlighted, the most critical rich information is when the intersections of data come together, and yet that's what puts our privacy at most at risk. My thoughts about this are rudimentary at best, but kind of here goes. The first is that we absolutely need to be talking about this, and I've been trying to figure out the different places to make sure that we get the conversation out there. And you know, certainly privacy groups have been talking about this for a long time, but the stance of, so we're just not going to do anything, isn't an adequate stance either. And so that's my second point, is that basically just saying, and therefore everything has to stop, is not a way forward. My third point is that there are a lot of technical solutions we need to start bringing to bear, and we need to study them all. And as FDA, I feel like I need to be a steward of studying them. As a practical example, synthetic data may be one example to allow us to get the richness of the enhanced understanding of intersections of data without compromising privacy. And so thinking about what are the technical solutions like synthetic data sets to be brought to bear. And then if I think about the third part of our technology modernization plan, I actually think one of the things we're going to want to do is goose the data and tech industry to come up with new solutions to solve for this. And so that's part of the reason for that third part of the plan, is to start to say what matters and we need to solve for.
Yep. Do you have another question? Hang on a second. I think we have one from the app. Or no? Did you? Oh, couldn't see. Okay. All right. Oh, okay.
Hi.
One more question, and
yeah,
then I
right
have
at
a
it.
final question.
Hi.
Hi, Nina Koshan from Amgen. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the progress of the Pq Cmc Initiative, especially with regard to the pilot program and when we might expect guidance from FDA.
Oh, that's a really great question. I probably can't tell you the right answer to that. I wish I looked it up before I came. But I don't know the answer, and I'll see if I have somebody get back to you on that one. So I think we are right at time, aren't
We are,
we?
yep. And I'll have one more question for us to finish, and this is something that came out of your videos that I really appreciated. You've been in medicine, academia, industry, and now regulatory. And one of the things that CAS as an organization has as a mission is to knowledge share and communicate globally among various specialties. And we struggle sometimes with being able to communicate across all these disciplines. Can you just give us a couple of parting words about your ideas and your experiences with communication among disparate subject matter experts?
Oh, so certainly this has been what I've been living as I've gone from place to place, and three core points. The first is that communication across disparate subject matter experts is best when you can create the even playing field. As soon as there's a power imbalance at the table, it becomes really hard to get all the important voices and all the different sides of looking at a problem at the table. And that means you need to have leadership in getting that equal table. I used to call this, when I was at my last company, learning to sit on the floor, where as you know, the chief medical and chief scientific officer, I needed to sit on the floor just like everybody else, and I actually got to get rid of my title to make sure that my voice didn't have unequal power at the table, so to speak, than anybody else's. So the first is making sure that there is an even playing field for communication. The second is lingua franca. One of the things I've realized is the same thing means something different in healthcare and tech and regulatory, and figuring out both what are the words that have different meaning by expertise, and then also how do we come to common ground. Sometimes we just had, when we were at my last company, we just make up words that would act as substitute or proxies. And so that's the third thing. And then the last thing, which I think kind of comes from those two, are humility. The best way to learn it and get multiple people talking together is to show leadership and humility, and also sort of telling stories.
It's a good one.
Thank you.
Well, I'll say thank you. I will tell you that what you got in 45 minutes is just a fraction of what you can get online. If you're interested in more of Dr. Abernethy's views, past, present, and future, I would certainly encourage you to go to the internet and Google her name. You'll be richly rewarded with some additional information.
you.
And if we could say thank you so much for being here today.